Welcome to Season 4 of Public Health on Call, a podcast from the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. I'm Josh Sharfstein, Vice Dean for Public Health Practice and Community Engagement and a former Commissioner of Health in Baltimore City. Our goal is to bring scientific evidence and experience to current topics in public health through engaging interviews with scientists, community leaders, policy experts, public health officials, clinicians, and more. If you have ideas or questions for us to cover, please email us at publichealthquestion@jhu.edu. That's publichealthquestion@jhu.edu for future podcast episodes.
Hi, I'm Lindsay Smith-Rogers, the producer of Public Health on Call. Today, I talk with Dr. John Groopman, an environmental epidemiologist at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, about climate disruption and infrastructure in the context of recent catastrophic events, the history of how we got here, and why there are reasons for optimism. Let's listen. John Groopman, thanks so much for joining us today. This summer, we've seen some devastating and deadly events related to climate disruption and infrastructure. We've got the record heat wave in the Pacific Northwest, the tragic collapse of the condo building in Miami, floods in Europe, rockslide in India. It feels like these things have happened in rapid succession and in places we may not have associated with climate change. How did we get here?
No, that's a terrific question. And actually, I think I'd like to give a little bit of a perspective of how we've evolved to the point that all of these things seem to be coming together at the same time. And much of this traces back to how energy and transportation developed in the industrialized societies of our planet starting over 200 years ago. As you know, Baltimore was one of the hubs of the beginning of the railroad industry in North America. And at that time, the steam engine was being developed, and the original use of the steam engine was to actually pump water out of coal mines in order to be able to process more coal, in order to produce more energy, in order to drive industrial processes. And very quickly in the 19th century, we had the transition from coal to oil, the increase in the number of transportation mechanisms. In the 20th century, with the automobile and the airplane, we gained ever greater speeds and ever greater connectivity around our planet. But each of these steps came at a cost, and that cost was to increase the amount of energy that we could consume for transportation, for industrialization, for growth. Always came at a cost to the environment in terms of the production of carbon dioxide as a byproduct, in terms of a whole variety of pollutants that are resultant of these engines and moving our transportation sector to move food around the country and around the planet. And so all of these things together over the last 150 years has led to this enormous increase in carbon dioxide in our atmosphere. And collectively, all of these factors are playing a role that are now being played out by these individual events that you have articulated. Our challenge as a society, our challenge as a global planet, is how do we address in order to stem the tide of these disasters, in order for people to be able to have the breathing space, if you will, in order to respond appropriately.
And we've seen other aberrations, let's say, in the past in terms of heat waves and things like that. So how do you contextualize things that have happened maybe in the last couple of decades versus what's happening now?
Well, I think for many of us who are living today, we certainly recall some of the air pollution inversions in the late 1960s into the 1970s from high sulfur oil that was used for heating. I certainly recall a decade or so ago, the tremendous heat waves that impacted Chicago and in Europe, where thousands of people died because of these very high temperatures, similar to what's being seen this week in the Pacific Northwest. And all of these events really galvanized a number of actions on the part of governments and society. In the case of the air pollution inversions in the 1960s, these were major contributors to the creation of the Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, and the creation of the Environmental Protection Agency. Our challenge today is that many of these events are occurring across transnational boundaries. And as a consequence, These are no longer local or national problems. They are really global problems.
So let's talk about then sort of these dual challenges of we've got a changing climate and all these climate disruptions. And at the same time, there's now a push to address aging infrastructure that needs to be fixed or replaced. And it feels a little like there's a race between these two things, but one's probably more of a long game than the other, right? So let's talk about that.
Okay, fair question. I mean, I think that one of the challenges that we have is that we cannot replace our aging infrastructure with the same type of infrastructure. These are opportunities to actually use creative approaches to addressing these infrastructure situations. For an example, the National Academy of Engineering views that the creation of the electric grid in the United States was one of the key major contributions of engineering in the 20th century. Now, that electrical grid, as you're well aware, is stressed. It was designed for a certain type of load of electricity. We have far outstripped it, and we now have other sources of the generation of electricity. And the ability of wind power, solar, a variety of these electrical generation mechanisms that 20 years ago we thought was science fiction, but today is a reality, is being imposed upon an old infrastructure that can't handle those loads. And so if we replace the old infrastructure with the same old engineering, we're going to be no better off down the line than we are today.
So far we've been talking about infrastructure in places like the US and Europe, but let's talk a little bit more about the impacts of climate disruption on places that don't have the same infrastructure issues that we do.
Well, this is a really critical problem because of the enormous population density and population growth in different parts of the world. We still have tremendous Northern Hemisphere versus Southern Hemisphere disparity in terms of economics, job growth, and the like. But if you simply look at the electricity utilization per person in different countries across the planet, you'll see that Canada and the United States have among the highest utilization of electricity per person compared to countries such as India, China, much less utilization in other parts of Southeast Asia and in South and Central America. And as a consequence, one of the challenges we have is as many societies are increasing their economic wealth, and indeed that in turn translates into better health, the ability to deliver these energy resources to these areas is under enormous stress. Just as one example, in Maryland, we get about 30% of our electricity from nuclear power. We get probably less than 20% from coal. We get a fair amount from natural gas generation. If you compare that to the country of Thailand, Thailand has no nuclear power plants. Probably 3/4 of the electricity generated in Thailand comes from coal. And this is coal power via the generation in various neighboring countries that is then transported into the country. So as a consequence, this utilization of some of our poorer quality energy resources in countries that are undergoing tremendous population and economic growth is a real challenge that we need to deal with from a global perspective.
And so in the US, Biden is addressing the infrastructure side of things with his plan that's being currently discussed right now. And then in Europe, they're sort of addressing the climate change by talking about taxing jet fuel and banning the sales of gas-powered vehicles. Are these things really helpful for the greater picture?
Well, I think that the transition from internal combustion engines to drive automobiles and trucks to utilizing rechargeable batteries through electrical generation will be an important transition for our societies. Certainly, when I see that the top-selling vehicles in the United States are light-duty pickup trucks, that certainly does represent perhaps a use of the transportation sector that may be disconnected with what would be a traditional use of a light-duty truck. Nonetheless, as I'm sure you're aware, Ford has just announced that the F-150 truck next year is going to be all electric. And as a consequence of that, this is going to have, I think, a very powerful impact on our society, because when a major manufacturer changes the fundamental structure of a major vehicle that is marketed and sold across the country, irrespective of what state, whether you're north, south, east, or west, this is going to lead to an acceptance and the recognition that the days of the internal combustion engine is starting to come to a close. And that will hopefully have further intended consequences as we deal with all of these climate-related issues.
So let's talk about what you foresee happening in the short term, let's say over the next 6 months to a year, especially as, here in the U.S., we are at the beginnings of fire and hurricane season with predictions that are starting to feel dire. And then we can kind of zoom out a little bit and talk about the next 5 to 10 years. But let's start with the immediate future. Where do you see things going now?
So obviously, I don't have a great crystal ball. I wish I did. But in the same way that a weather forecaster isn't particularly good at telling you what the weather is going to be 2 or 3 days from now, a climate forecaster is probably just as poor in terms of where we're going to be 6 months or a decade from now. But I think what is really disturbing, I think, for a lot of us, and maybe those of us in academia have not been good transmitters of information or good, if you will, teachers to society. But if we think back to 2005 with Hurricane Katrina and what amounted to a climate refugee situation of all of the people who were not only stranded in the Gulf Coast, but all the people who left New Orleans, went to Houston, went to a whole variety of other places, and never returned. It is perhaps symbolic of the type of climate refugee situation that we are going to be confronted with in ever-increasing frequency as these storms are playing an important role, and as we recognize that the insurance industry here and around the world will probably get to the point where they decide that the premiums and the liability of carrying insurance in these flood zones and these zones that are most susceptible to climate change is not worth carrying.
Aside from making light-duty trucks electric vehicles, what do you think could be a huge game changer in this conversation?
Well, I have to say that if we were having this conversation a year and a half ago, and you asked me, well, over the next 6 months, what are you going to be doing? I would probably be able to tick off 10, maybe 15 flights that I would be taking to various places, the one-day seminars that I would be giving somewhere, the 3 trans-Pacific flights that I would be taking because of the studies that we do in Asia and South Asia, perhaps the occasional trip to a meeting in Europe. These I would have viewed as being sort of essential parts of my professional life and my academic career. What the last year and a half has taught us is that moving things by electrons, whether it's by Zoom or these sorts of conversations, and not getting in a plane and increasing my carbon footprint enormously, is something that I've become accustomed to. Many of my colleagues have become accustomed to it. Certainly a lot of the students we teach have seen the pluses and the minuses of this. But I think that this has had a profound impact on the people who probably contribute the most to carbon footprint, which often are the wealthier people or the people of greater means and the like. And this is likely to have a profound impact that we're only beginning to appreciate in terms of how, if you will, how we do business. I think that's a plus.
Anything else you'd like to add for this conversation?
Well, I think the only thing that I'd really like to add is that the enormous opportunity for really dealing with a number of the health disparity issues, a number of the academic disparity issues, the opportunity to really change our societies across the globe, put forth by really the challenges that climate change very broadly places, is really something that I would like to believe that the incredible drive and innovation that many people have, if supported, whether it's by the Biden administration or other sources, if supported, can really lead to quantum changes in how we approach things and how we can address many of these problems. I'd like to just leave you with one final sort of vignette, if you will, and that really goes back in 1974. Mario Molina and Roland published a paper in Nature where they put forth that there was a hypothesis that chlorofluorocarbons, which were major propellants in aerosol cans and the like at that time, that the chemistry and the resultant changes in the atmospheric chemistry of these compounds could lead to a degradation of ozone that would play an incredibly important role and does play an important role in terms of protecting all of us from ultraviolet radiation. That was a hypothesis. In 12 years, these compounds were banned by international consent led by the United States. These compounds went away. And that was before the fundamental science had been done to demonstrate that which they were proposing, that which they won a Nobel Prize for, was in fact true. And so I take a fair amount of optimism, as I think all of us in public health do, in seeing that in the not too distant past, we really made a difference very, very quickly. And can we use that legacy in order to address these major issues that we're facing today?
John Groopman, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Public Health on Call is produced by Josh Sharfstein, Lindsay Smith-Rogers, and Stephanie Desmond. Audio production by Spencer Greer, Niall Owen McCusker, Cian Oates, and Matthew Martin, with support from Chip Hickey. Distribution by Nick Moran. Production support from Catherine Ricardo and Neiman Outland. Social media support from Brenda Haggader, Grace Holes Fernandez, and Caroline Wong. Thank you for listening.